Welcome everyone to another community session here, our Power Half Hours, our monthly ritual in the Compete Network community. I'm Adam McQueen, and joining me today, a familiar face. He's part of the product marketing crew at Klue. It's none other than Eric Holland. Eric, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for the invite, and happy Friday, everybody.
What we're talking about is the 5 questions that you need to be asking your buyer and why. Eric, first of all, let's just level set. What's the importance of conducting buyer interviews with strong questions? And give me a story, maybe a good example or a bad example of what that meant for you in your role.
Well, yeah, like if you're not conducting buyer interviews and buyer research in 2024, what are you doing? Like that's that simple. I mean, anyone who's done any type of that research, whether it's something formal like win-loss or just getting on a call with a customer asking about a new product you released, you can see the outpour of information that you wouldn't normally get anywhere else. I had a great conversation the other day with someone who says that type of research actually takes the temperature and takes all of the fighting out of the room. And the decision-making process gets so much better. So I think, in those 3 areas, it's kind of a no-brainer now to get out there and ask your buyers some really important questions. And that's why we're here today. I think you pinned out 5 of them. I think we could definitely get away with at least 5 to understand your buyers and, get those insights that you're looking for.
For sure. We're going to jump into what those 5 are. We're going to do a fun little countdown style. Eric, you're going to walk us through. Before you do so, give me a story time. Give me a story time, good or bad, about some buyer interviews you've conducted in some of your previous roles in the product marketing world.
Yeah. So in a past life, worked at it was, for lack of a better term, cloud storage for people who make movies, TV shows, video games, that type of stuff. And there was a huge debate going on internally of what's that next big feature we need to make. And one of them was an audit trail. Won't bore you with those details. And the other one was a mobile app, right? And 2 completely different paths to take. And let's just say the loudest voice in the room at the time was not the buyer. And the decision was basically leaning very heavily into the audit trail because there was a few big companies who wanted that feature. We took a pause, did some of these interviews, did some research to be like, hey, what's your key problem right now? And it was overwhelmingly that we needed the video editors and the other content folks who were producing this stuff to be able to work from a mobile setting, right? So it was very clear that within, we did about 3 weeks of research, a little bit of survey based, a little bit of interviews. And it was overwhelming the amount of actual need for one feature versus the other. And then, of course, you pair that in with your revenue data, and the decision was a no-brainer. And it took all that temperature out of the room, like I said.
Took out all of the bias. All right, let's do this countdown style. Eric, you've got the 5 questions. We'll see how many we can get to because we also want to get some time for community questions. There was a bunch sent in advance that I really want to kind of tackle as well. So, Eric, drum roll, please. What's the first question folks should be asking their buyer?
Yeah, I think this one's like table stakes. You got to ask this one, and that's what business or technical problem led you to evaluate this company, and obviously the other ones that are going to come up later with other questions. I think the main reason why I like it is because it digs into that core context of what they're trying to do, right? Like a use case. And then you start getting into the actual problem. And for me, as a product marketer and doing CI work, it's really important that we have strong positioning. And there's 2 ways you can kind of do that. That's contextual and that's competitive. And that first piece gives you that contextual part, like what's the overarching problem that we can solve? And then that's going to help you craft your messaging, obviously deliver that to your sales team. And then your sales team can repeatedly, bang that drum over and over with their prospects. So I think that is like I said, table stakes when I think of what questions do we start asking when we do these interviews.
I know our own team here are drinking our own champagne, eating our own dog food, and whatever you want to call it, on our own win-loss program between yourself, Hunter, and Cody. Has anything kind of stood out to you, your crew, with around this kind of line of questioning to start here, or how you've been using the findings from this kind of opening question for some of the work that your crew's doing on the product marketing team?
Yeah, I think it really opens up the conversation for like, what are people actually going to use this for? How can we make sure that like we're crystal clear in our message? Because, I think everyone's got their own take on what a product can be used for and what's the best use, and where should we drive people to actually see the value. But if you just go back to the drawing board, again, ask your buyers, like, what is the purpose of this? Where do you see the value? You're going to uncover all of those things, like key motivators, of course, the urgency behind this. You're going to start to paint that picture. And I think, again, all key things that we're going to be able to use as we craft a better story at Klue.
All right, give me question 2 here. What's second on your list?
Well, I'm sure most of us are here to talk about competitors, right? And so number 2, which other vendors did you seriously consider and why? The reason I like that question, again, back to the positioning, that contextual piece is great. So if you think of like, let's just go with Calendly, for example, right? They're positioning themselves within a workflow, like schedule your meetings online without going back and forth on emails. When you think of a competitive lens, right? Like Loom, for example, they're just saying, skip the meeting altogether, right? Don't even book a meeting, just send a Loom video. So I really like this question because now you can identify your direct competitors, which we all really need to know. Then you can dig into those perceived strengths, those perceived weaknesses, and you can start positioning to basically say, choose us instead of them. And so I think that question, you layer that on top of point 1, now you're really having a stronger story in the market. And of course, we need to help our sales reps win those deals. And I think that gives you that, you're fine tuning everything to, again, back to what I said, why should you pick us versus them? Instead of just, why should you add us into your workflow?
You're definitely walking along the buyer journey a little bit. You know what? This question, obviously, we actually had a couple community questions here on a similar topic to this that I'll flip to you, but it reminds me of something. We conducted a bunch of interviews with product marketers when we were down at Spring by Winter. And one of the folks, we chatted a little bit about this. And what she mentioned in her own experience was like, oftentimes teams have this kind of lens on who their direct competitors are. The people that play in the exact same space as you, that everyone in the company knows, the familiar faces. But what was interesting to her, she started to do more buyer interviews, win-loss interviews, and asked this kind of question, is other kind of adjacent ways of solving the problem were coming up that weren't in that direct competitive set of like, we do the exact same things. It's just another way of doing something. It's kind of to your point of like that Calendly Loom example. It's like, yeah, obviously we know we're directly selling against this kind of competitor, but there's so many other sort of like, I don't even know how you'd want to call them, like adjacent categories or adjacent ways to kind of solve the same problem that folks are thinking about that is often not in the company. Like you're the 4 walls of your company aren't necessarily thinking about those other kind of solutions too.
Yeah, 100%. I would even, take a guess that the natural chain of events does not say for, the person at Calendly, I should go do competitive research against Loom. But once you ask that question, what other vendors are you considering to solve that problem of meetings? It's going to pop up. And now you can of course equip your sellers with that talk track because it's inevitably going to come up.
I got a couple questions from folks before, and I've seen this question come up so many times. What are delicate ways within these interviews to ask if they're looking at competitors to our solution? Do we need to be delicate in the first place here?
Well, if you ask me, who's a natural bull in a china shop, I tell you no. It's going to be very dependent, particularly on what industry you're in, for one. Like that's one of the biggest factors I see is if you're in a really sensitive, let's say government, for example, right? Like you're very sensitive to the conversations that you're allowed to have and some of the information that you give out. So that one's a little bit harder. But I think, my rule of thumb is just be confident in asking those questions. I think buyers, naturally are smart enough to know that, there's other competitors. And if you approach it in such a way that's, very tactful, similar like how I phrased it, like what other vendors were you considering during this process, as opposed to like, there's a few aggressive ways you could phrase that question. I've never ran into an instance where people are like, yeah, I'd rather not tell you. So that's my advice. Now, if you do run it again, like a situation where things are a little bit more sensitive, just make sure you take that question and make sure you're taking the time to find those things that they're not going to trigger people to be so turned off. For example, like vendors, I think is a great word to use as opposed to say competitors, right? Like we have a bunch of these competitors. Which ones did you evaluate? I think that changing it and flipping it to what other vendors kind of takes the temperature out of the room a little bit. Don't want to dig that too deep, but I'd say just jump in with confidence. People know what's coming. People are most likely evaluating other vendors, and they're probably in the same situation if they're selling software, especially.
I think as well, when you mention like you're going to set the context of that first question, is like also the order in which you ask your questions. If you came off the bat like that, if you hop onto an interview and within the first like 1 to 2 questions is that, now you're kind of setting a little bit of a weird context. Like, am I just getting interrogated on what the competitors are doing compared to us? But when you set up like, what's that technical business problem, some of the important factors in your kind of decisions to choose solving this problem. And then it's like, okay, now who are you evaluating? It's just a more logical flow for the buyer to just share their side of the story rather than like, hey, who else were you looking at over there?
Yeah, even like frame it like, hey, what were some of your favorite vendors that you saw, right? Like give them that really almost flattering language that really makes it feel like you're not digging for that dirt. I found that to be definitely a receptive way to send it out.
All right, Eric, give me question 3 here.
Let's dig in a little deeper right now. We've got the competitors listed a little bit. Let's actually get some differentiation points. So my next favorite question is when you were comparing insert company name here, what were those appealing features? What was that like thing that was super intriguing about competitor or company X versus some of the other ones you saw? I really love this because, now we've gotten our layer of what's the problem. Now we've essentially figured out a general high-level overview of what was so appealing about each individual competitor. Now you can get that layer deeper and find what was that thing, that aha moment, that little point of differentiation that I can take back and use and work into our narrative, right? So, of course, that could be with yourself, that could be with another competitor, but you take that back and that's how you reevaluate how you position and how you communicate your value compared to, company X. So I really like that in terms of layer. And like you said before, layering it in after that previous question. Don't just like jump into, hey, what'd you think about this competitor? Level set with them, get them open up, and then get a little bit more specific with that point of differentiation.
Tom over from Fluvio mentioned as well, one of the things he likes to ask is, what is the most important metric you're held to as well? Tom, if you want to kind of explain that one out as well in chat, like why do you like asking that one? And I'll flip this to you, Eric. Like, have you asked something similar to that as well? Like, why that line of questioning?
That is a great question, particularly when you're getting into like the emotional aspect and you can start talking and be like, hey, what happens if you don't hit that metric? And kind of really, I think is almost like a 1A level question to that first one of what's that business problem? Now, not just what's the business problem, what are you responsible for as it ties to that business problem? I think that's a great question to ask.
Mike was kind of mentioning like from a marketing side, maybe you open with these matrices, it might actually expose your potential customers. In a sales process, it's about positioning to win. But I think this is even slightly different, right? This is more this like post-deal cycle research feedback. Like it's even slightly different to maybe this marketing and sales, which is all still pre-sales motion.
Yeah, I agree. Like this to me would be more of a research post-sale, whether that's, new customers or you're doing a churn or a stay interview, so to speak. You're doing a great job working the deal as an AE. I wouldn't necessarily just arbitrarily toss over a competitive matrix and say, hey, check out all these other folks and complicate your decision-making process. I think this would be much more suited for research as opposed to something, in the deal cycle.
We've done our 3 questions. You want to wrap the final 2 questions as well within the 5 questions you need to ask your buyer, and then we'll take some of these community questions here because I got a couple I really want to get your take on and the chat's take on as well.
Yeah, so this will go back a couple questions. I guess I'd probably layer this in after question 1 about once you find the problem, the business problem. I'd jump in. What were the 3 most important factors in your decision? Because now I think you've gotten kind of a taste of what their decision-making criteria was, a little bit of that urgency. But now this really gets you to the point of you can communicate. Here are the things that are causing your impact, right? Or causing that consequential problem. Here are like the things that are actually leading up to it. I think that's almost, and a lot of times, more important than just finding the business problem, because not everyone goes into their job every day thinking about the overarching business problem. A lot of times they're thinking of one of those leading things, which they're directly contributed to, which back to Tom's question, right? What metrics are you tied to would be a great follow-up to that, right? So now you've got your layer of the business problem. You've got these like influencing factors that are creating this issue for everybody. And then you can say what's your direct part in all that and solving that problem. So that would be that next question and why I like that one so much.
And then take us home. What's the 5th one here?
Yeah, take us home, baby. So Friday, finishing off with probably one of everyone in Compete's at least favorite questions is, what are your strengths and weaknesses? And so that you can find out, like, all right, I know who is actually I'm playing against, who are the people in this deal. And then you just get to that level of what did you see in the deal? What were some of the things that happened during your conversations with sales that you didn't have with those other conversations with other reps? What were some of the features that they showed you that really wooed you that you didn't see across the other board? How did they talk about their onboarding process, right? And I think all of those things you can start to get to with that question, which everyone gets value from. And you can start weaving that into a lot of things depending on your role, right? You might be doing positioning messaging work. You might be building that sales content. You might be trying to train other reps on how to actually have these conversations. So I think that question is super important, and you can use that information for a lot of different things.
I'm going to flip this over to some of my favorite questions we got from the community ahead of time. First one here, Eric, from a familiar face in the community, Tracy Berry, and also Christian shared a similar question too. Was what is one question you should not ask in a buyer interview? There's probably a lot you shouldn't, but if you had one you shouldn't ask, what would it be?
Age and weight, definitely. Don't ask those questions. But I would say, wow, this one caught me off guard. So give me like 2 seconds to let my brain run through it. One question that I just don't find overly useful in terms like if you have a shorter interview is, where'd you find us? All right, I really don't like that question a whole lot. I know it is baked into certain people's research processes. And a lot of times, I'll be honest, it's super helpful in terms of like the marketing funnel and determining on what type of programs to put more fuel on and maybe or some off. But I find that a lot of times it's kind of like it's almost like a yes or no question, right? It's like, oh, I found you on your website, or oh, I found you here or there. It's almost like a form submission question. And a lot of times I can't get as much information out of that as I would like. And I can't do a lot with it.
One thing that because I've had the fortune of having a lot of our awesome research directors here at Klue on some of our community sessions, just chatting with them anyways, doing content with them. And one of the big things also, this kind of ties into my world and like content world too, is that specific question, but a line of questioning that does not work, especially when this is like huge for research and kind of getting your buyer to talk, to share. Closed-ended questions. Closed-ended questions. Yes or no questions. Point in time questions. You're kind of closing off the conversation or the opportunity to go deeper as well with your buyer. I remember Robin on our research, like one of our research directors, and also Bruce, same thing. It's like always try to have these questions end with an open-ended kind of flow to it so that you're allowing the person to kind of walk through their process, because that's ultimately like what you're trying to accomplish. So I don't have a specific question, but chatting with some of the experts on our teams, I know that's like one of the like number one rules in their sort of approach to asking these kind of questions. And this is where we get a bit more nuance too, is how do you get to the root problem or real answer when you're conducting some of these interviews?
Kind of tying back to some of those, like, what are the 5 questions? When you ask like that first question, what was that business technical problem led to evaluate, right? Like, you're going to let them talk, of course. And that question should lead to a pretty good answer. It may be also like you were just talking about, it might almost lead them to we're losing too many deals, right? Or something like that. And that's almost too vague, in a way. So you have to just continuously be willing to pry to unpack that more, right? I love that phrase. Unpack that some more for me, and force them to keep on going and really like dig into, okay, so we dug into this report, we saw this was happening, then we realized that because of this, we're not going to reach our goals, right? And as opposed to like, we're just losing deals. To me, because you've been willing to not take them at their face answer and dig in a little bit deeper, obviously warm them up to unpack those things. I think that to me is like the best way to get there. And typically it'll be like 3 lines of questioning, and you could actually come out with that, be like, yep, all right, here's their root problem, and hopefully here's how we can address it.
We're coming up here, but I got one more that I really wanted to ask you. And then this is also kind of related to some of the work that the product marketing team at Klue is doing, is buyer interviews aren't just net new deals. You could be doing churn interviews, upsell interviews, cross-sell interviews, renewal interviews, like all of the above. What are kind of the differences in the questions you would ask between these different buyer types, whether it is a renewal, a churn, an upsell, those kind of different motions? In
a lot of ways, I wouldn't suggest like changing them too much. So for example, if you ask the question in a new customer or even a lost deal, what business or technical problem led you to evaluate us and others? I would say then when you're talking to someone who's either staying and renewing with you or leaving because of a churn, I would flip that question just slightly and be like, what business or technical problem made you stay? Or what business or technical problem made you feel like you needed to look elsewhere? So not necessarily like changing your questions too much. I just think kind of flipping them to fit that scenario is probably your best bet, because one, you still need to get that information, right? Like knowing why people are staying with you from a business problem perspective is just as important as them finding you in the first place. But it also gives you some consistency as you start to report on these things and find these trends, on being like, okay, I've asked this question. Here's why people are coming in, but unfortunately they might not be staying for this. So how do we fix that? And I think it gives you some level of consistency, like I said, as you look at these answers in these different buyer categories.
Eric, I appreciate, as always, hopping in here, chatting with the community and folks in attendance. Have a great Friday and a great long weekend if you're in North America.
Happy Friday.